So much of what survives of their story feels like a warning written in shadows. Not a warning about them, but about us. About how quickly a nation can abandon its own, how silence and shame can rot through families until blood itself becomes a curse. The Appalachian mothers were not witches or villains, though outsiders branded them as such. They were women who bore the unbearable because there was no other path, who carried forward generations that were already broken, because to stop was unthinkable. In their silence we see the reflection of a truth too many fear, that horror does not need monsters, only neglect. Their children walked crooked paths not because they were born evil, but because they were born into a cage built by circumstance and bound by blood. And through it all, the mothers endured, their lives reduced to whispered legends, to grim cautionary tales told by people who never once looked them in the eye. What we call America's darkest mothers were not shadows in the woods, but women with calloused hands, cracked lips, and tired hearts, women who wept into quilts at night, who buried children without headstones, who whispered prayers to a God they could not see. If their story unsettles you, it should. It was meant to be hidden. Families erased their names, towns refused to speak of them, and history turned its face away. But silence is never permanent. The mountains hold memory the way stone holds fossils, pressed deep, waiting for those brave enough to uncover them. And now, you have seen a glimpse. The question is not whether you believe it, but whether you can live with it. Can you walk away from their story and forget the faces of women who bore generations into darkness? Or will you carry them, as they carried the weight of silence, into the light of memory? The hills are still there. The cabins may have collapsed, the family lines scattered, but their presence lingers, heavy and unyielding. And if you ever find yourself in those forgotten valleys, remember, the silence pressing against your skin is not the silence of emptiness. It is the silence of mothers whose cries were never heard, whose lives were never spared, whose stories now belong to you. The truth is that these women were never meant to be remembered. History prefers its mothers noble, gentle, self-sacrificing in ways that comfort the storyteller. But the Appalachian mothers who bore inbred generations were neither myth nor morality tale. They were flesh and bone, trapped in cycles that stripped away the possibility of choice. Their story lingers only in fragments, in whispers of neighbors, in yellowed county records, in graves without names. And yet, those fragments tell us more about America than we wish to know. They reveal a nation willing to look away. A nation that carved railroads through the mountains, mined its coal, drained its veins of labor, and yet left its people in darkness, forgotten once their usefulness was spent. Poverty did not appear by chance. It was engineered, generation after generation, until the mountains themselves became a cage. And within that cage, the women carried the heaviest burden of all. Their bodies became battlegrounds where history, silence, and survival collided. What haunts us most is not the deformities, nor the whispered tales of strange faces peering from broken porches. What haunts us is the endurance of the mothers themselves. Year after year, child after child, they bore the weight of lives that were never truly their own. No rescue came. No reckoning arrived. They lived, they labored, and they died, carrying their secrets into shallow graves, but if you listen closely, you can still hear them. In the creak of an abandoned cabin's door, in the rustle of weeds growing where children once played, in the wind curling through hollow valleys where names have long been lost. The silence they left behind is not empty. It is heavy, thick with a grief that cannot be spoken aloud. And it presses on anyone who dares to step close, who dares to ask the questions no one wanted answered. America's darkest mothers remain unseen, but not gone. They are there, in the forgotten soil, in the faded photographs, in the faces of descendants who still walk among us. And as long as their story is buried, the land itself will carry their memory, waiting for someone willing to look, and to listen. There were moments, brief and fragile, when the weight of their lives cracked open and something human slipped through. A child's laugh, though jagged and strange, could fill a room with a sound that almost felt ordinary. A mother, worn and gaunt, might smile as she braided the tangled hair of a daughter whose eyes could not meet her own. These were not grand triumphs, but small rebellions against the darkness, proof that even in a prison built of blood and silence, the instinct to nurture could not be fully extinguished, but these moments never lasted. Hunger returned, harder than joy. Illness swept through cabins with no medicine to fight it. Winter winds cut through broken windows, and the mothers, too tired to weep, wrapped their children in quilts made from rags and prayed the cold would pass them by. Sometimes it did. Often, it did not. And when the children died, as so many did, the women buried them with their own hands. They placed stones at the head of the graves, but they spoke no words. What could they say? Words had failed them long ago. Those who tried to break the cycle found the world outside was no sanctuary. In towns beyond the hollers, whispers followed them like smoke. Outsiders recoiled at their accents, their clothes, the faint but unmistakable marks of inbreeding stamped across their features. The women were not free, they had only exchanged one kind of prison for another. Some returned to the mountains in shame. Others lingered in the margins of towns, working laundries or scrubbing floors, carrying secrets they dared never reveal, yet even in silence, memory has a way of surviving. Old photographs, faded and curled at the edges, show these women standing with their children, unsmiling, eyes hollow yet defiant. In their faces is a haunting truth: they were not villains, not monsters, but survivors of a story America chose to bury. To look at them is to glimpse a reality most would rather turn away from, a reality where motherhood itself became an inheritance of suffering. The land still holds them. The valleys remember. And when you stand in those hills today, you may feel it, a silence that presses against your skin, as if the earth itself is still carrying the weight of the mothers who once lived there, who once bled there, who once prayed for a salvation that never came. By the middle of the 20th century, the outside world began to glimpse what the mountains had long concealed. Social workers, journalists, and wandering photographers stumbled into the hollows, their eyes widening at the sight of families whose features bore the unmistakable stamp of blood turned inward. But while outsiders saw spectacle, the mothers saw shame. They pulled curtains tighter, sent children scurrying into back rooms, and lowered their eyes when questioned. Their voices, when forced to answer, were little more than murmurs. They had been conditioned not to speak, because speaking meant judgment, and judgment meant danger. The government files that exist today read like clinical autopsies of a hidden world. Reports of low intelligence, of unsanitary conditions, of physical deformities. Yet behind every sterile word was a woman. A mother standing barefoot on a dirt floor, trying to explain why her child could not speak, or why another child wandered aimlessly in circles, humming the same tune over and over. The officials rarely asked about her, about the bruises on her wrists, the hollow look in her eyes, the exhaustion carved deep into her face. To them, she was only a vessel, an extension of a tragedy they could not comprehend and did not care to. Some of the mothers began to believe what they were told. That they were cursed. That their wombs were coffins delivering life already marked for suffering. Faith was twisted into blame, and blame sank its claws into every generation. And still, they endured. The cycle pressed on, because the mountains did not open easily, and the chains of kinship were harder still to break. That it is easy, from the outside, to see only horror. To reduce these women to shadows in a tale of deformity and despair. But horror, in its truest form, lies not in the grotesque, but in the silence of those who bore it. In the they folded clothes for children who could not dress themselves, in the way they spoon-fed grown sons whose minds never left infancy, in the way they smiled, thin, weary smiles, when strangers stared. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? The women never asked that question aloud, but you can feel it in every forgotten cabin, in every unmarked grave. What would you have done, if escape was never an option, and silence was the only inheritance you could give? Generations blurred in those mountains, as though time itself had folded in on the families that lived there. A grandmother, weathered and bent from years of toil, would rock a child whose blood was tangled in ways that could no longer be traced. A mother would labor beside her daughter, their lives bound not only by kinship but by the same man who had fathered them both. It was a cycle so deeply rooted that the women themselves struggled to define the lines between past and present, between mother and child, between sin and survival. There are whispers, preserved in the brittle pages of county records and the fading memories of neighbors who dared not speak too loudly. They tell of women who gave birth in silence, cutting their own cords with rusted blades. They tell of newborns buried on family land, their graves marked by nothing more than a fieldstone pressed into the soil. For every child who lived, another never drew breath long enough to cry. And the women bore these losses as if carrying water in a sieve, watching life slip away again and again. Outsiders who stumbled too close often recoiled. They saw faces that unsettled the stomach, gestures that seemed uncanny, as though the human form itself had been warped. Yet, for the mothers, there was no recoil. Their children, no matter how twisted by fate, were theirs to cradle, theirs to hush, theirs to love in silence. And in that silence lay the cruelest truth: the women were blamed for what they could not change. Branded as sinners, whispered about as monsters, when in truth, they were prisoners. Some tried to escape. A few left with nothing but a bundle of clothes, walking barefoot across miles of ridges. But blood has a way of pulling back, and hunger is an anchor few can cut loose from. Many who fled eventually returned, their children in tow, to the same cabins, the same faces, the same endless cycle of despair. And for those who never tried, resignation was a kind of death that arrived long before their bodies gave out. The mothers knew they were raising children who would never know freedom, who would never escape the cage of their bloodline. Yet still, they rocked them to sleep, still kissed their foreheads, still whispered lullabies as though the words alone could protect them. Their love was not a cure. It was a torch carried into a darkness that had no end. The land itself became a conspirator. Hills that rose like ancient walls sealed these families from the world, while valleys carved deep and narrow gave them no path but inward. Poverty was a gatekeeper, and isolation its cruel companion. The women who lived here were born into silence, their fates sealed long before the first cries of their own children. From birth, they were told that family was all they had, and family was all they would ever know. In a place where survival meant clinging to what little you had, the boundaries between kin and husband blurred, until even the mothers themselves could no longer untangle the web. These women carried shame, though it was not their own. The weight of every whisper, every wandering eye from outsiders, pressed upon them, even if they never stepped beyond the dirt paths of their hollows. Their children bore the marks most visibly: sloping foreheads, twisted jaws, eyes that refused to align. Each birth was a reminder that the curse of isolation had no mercy, and yet, the women endured. They endured childbirth after childbirth, their bodies worn, their spirits splintered, but their silence unbroken. It was in the kitchens where the secrets lived longest. A pot of beans simmering on the stove, a baby wailing in the corner, and another child at the table staring with wide, vacant eyes. Here, a mother wiped sweat from her brow, turned her face away from the deformities she could not name, and pressed forward as though normalcy could be forced into existence. She could not tell her children they were different, because difference itself had no meaning here. When every face bore the same haunting marks, abnormality became the new ordinary, and yet, within the stillness of night, when the lanterns dimmed and the holler fell quiet, some of these women prayed. They prayed not for themselves, but for an end they knew they would never live to see. They prayed for children who might one day walk free of the hills, free of the blood that bound them. Their prayers went unanswered, and the mountains echoed only with silence. Still, they whispered into the darkness, hoping that God had not forgotten them, even if the rest of the world had. Their story is not one of choice, but of inheritance, an unbroken cycle, where the role of mother was less a gift and more a sentence. And within each birth, the future sank deeper into the soil of the Appalachians. The first sound that lingers is silence. Not the ordinary hush of the woods or the quiet of night, but something heavier, as if the land itself remembers and does not wish to speak. Deep in the Appalachian hollows, far from paved roads and watchful neighbors, there lived women whose names were never written in family Bibles, never etched into stone. They were mothers, yet their motherhood carried a shadow darker than death. They bore children into a closed circle of blood, sons who were also nephews, daughters who were also cousins. These were not accidents of fate, but cycles repeated until faces blurred, and the very shape of humanity bent under the weight of repetition. In those forgotten homes, the walls knew. They saw young girls pulled from childhood too soon, told that duty outweighed choice, and silence was safer than questions. They carried the burden of generations, their wounds becoming both prison and passage for the next to suffer. To outsiders, they were invisible, shielded by the mountains themselves. But inside those cabins of wood and stone, behind curtains made from flour sacks, life twisted into something unrecognizable. The women did not speak much of love. Love was a word for the fortunate, a fragile thing too easily destroyed by what lived around them. Instead, they lived in resignation, in cycles that began before their mothers' mothers were born. And when the children came, frail bodies, wandering eyes, jaws set wrong by nature's protest, the mothers did what they always did. They wrapped them in old quilts, they hushed their cries, they carried them into a future that was already decided. It is easy to imagine they were cruel, but cruelty requires choice. These women had none. They bore the judgment of the outside world without ever seeing the faces that judged them. They lived inside a cage built not of iron but of blood, history, and silence. And still, they endured. Some prayed, others cursed the heavens, but all carried their line forward because they could not stop what had already begun long before they were born. This is the story America refuses to tell. The story of the mothers of inbred generations, hidden in the Appalachian night, their voices carried only by the wind through hollow valleys. And once you hear it, you will not forget.